Hey everyone, Pat Mayo here. Before we get into Drew Dinkmeyer and Mike Leone from DailyRoto.com, I got a giveaway for you people out there. At least one lucky person out there. You will get comped an entire NFL package from DailyRoto.com by doing one of two things. That's $129 value just to you if you're the lucky person drawn. And here's how you enter. Number one, give this episode a like right away in the comment section. Tell me your favorite week one value. Boom, you're in the draw. Second way to do it, go to Twitter, go to Facebook, share the show, give it a retweet or a share on Facebook, and then comment back to me with the hashtag DRNFL. Boom, you're in the draw. I will be announcing the winner on Thursday, August 30th, and you'll be ready for week one all the way through the playoffs. Also, if you do just want to get a Daily Roto package, we'll be talking a little bit about that in this. If you use the promo code THEPME, THEPME, right now, you'll get 10% off either the NFL or the All Sports package, the Elite package from Daily Roto. So, that's how you enter. You might as well do it. What can you lose? The only thing you can do is gain an NFL package from DailyRoto.com. Enjoy the show.
Mayo experience.
Mayo experience.
Mayo experience. Mayo experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, probably the most important show you're going to need to watch and or listen to. And if you're listening to this, I recommend you watch this one because it's going to be full of visuals that are going to correspond with what is being said, more so than any other show. It is the strategy and how to win, how to be better at DraftKings NFL, full strategy session, how to use tools, how to understand optimizers, how to project players out, how to understand things like range of outcome. And to bring this on, it's not going to be me dishing you advice because you don't want that nonsense. I got Drew Dinkmeyer and Mike Leone, the co-founders of DailyRoto.com, on the line right now. I do want to let everyone know, DailyRoto.com has their NFL package. They have two packages. They have one for NFL only, goes all the way through the playoffs. They also have the Elite package, which goes for every single sport all year round. And if you sign up right now and use the promo code THEPME, THEPME, you get 10% off. So, I mean, it's quite a deal to begin. It's only $129 for the entire football season anyway. You tack on 10% off and just giving away free picks, basically, at this point. Drew, Mike, what's happening?
We're excited for the NFL season. We're, way ahead of schedule from where we usually are. We've already got our projections out for week one. The optimizer is in really great shape. It's completely revamped for this year, which you'll see throughout this show. So we're excited. As you said, $129.99. We feel like it's a great price tag, given that you get access to our projections, the optimizer, range of outcomes projections, podcasts, premium articles, lineup alerts. So we're really excited for the season.
So one thing that we're really going to do is walk you through the process that Mike and Drew go through every week using the tools from DailyRoto.com. And like Mike said, $129 for the year. Use that promo code THEPME and get your 10% off. Drew, are there any new additions this year that you think will really help your process in either speeding it up or just giving you more information?
Yeah, I think we've added a lot of things to the table that can really help people this year. On the optimizer side, we've added the ability to control exposures and create groups and keys and different things that can help you build lineups more efficiently so that you don't have these weird kind of construction lineups that sometimes optimizers throw out there where you'll get like 3 wide receivers from the same team but without the quarterback and stuff like that. So we've created a lot more user customizability and flexibility to control the types of lineups the optimizer puts out. And then Mike's also been working on range of outcomes projections, which I think are really useful for GPPs. We'll have ownership projections on site. You can leverage those to create GPP lineups as well. But I think the range of outcomes really help separate, which types of players are more high variance players that fit GPPs better, and which types of players are a little bit more consistent players that might fit cash games a little bit better.
Okay, first things first, I want to get into cash construction versus GPP construction in terms of a really macro level of how you should really approach this and think about it. And Drew, since you've actually won a Millionaire Maker and Leone's best finish in any sort of Millionaire Maker is only second, we'll start with you because you're the best at this and Mike's like the worst for second in a Millionaire Maker. That's terrible. But when we're thinking about GPPs versus cash games, what's the initial thing right off the hop that people need to know, especially if you're just starting out for the first time?
I think the first two things that I think about to distinguish GPPs from cash games is GPPs, you really want to aim for the moon. You want correlated lineups. So you want lineups that when one player does well, another player on the lineup at least does well. And then you also want to take into consideration ownership. The lower owned the player is that projects well, the more appealing they are for a tournament perspective. Whereas cash games, you're not really concerned about ownership. You're more concerned about the floor of players' production. You want players that have multiple outs to potentially hit their value, like running backs that are pass catchers, so they're not game flow dependent. Tournaments, you don't have to worry about that because you're kind of creating a tournament lineup with a certain idea in mind of how a game might go that can get you to the top of the tournament leaderboard.
Mike, Drew mentioned ownership, and that's something that you need to focus on, especially if two players are one price and you have them projected similarly. Even if the floor and ceiling are a little bit different, that it's always better to go with the lower owned guy. Now, I see a lot of blowback on this, that people are like, well, you want to take the better player. But is this just the fact that we're better at projecting ownership than we are actual performance, that you go with the constant that you know and hope to get lucky with it?
Yeah, to a certain extent, for example, our week one projections on DraftKings, like we've got Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson projected within decimal points of one another. We're not going to even remotely pretend that we're that good, that 0.2 projection higher on Le'Veon Bell is that much better than David Johnson. But when you're building your cash game lineups, you get into this mode where you're taking the higher projected guy and maybe you're not putting as much thought into it. And that ownership carries over to tournaments. People like to use the players they use in cash games in their tournament lineups. They feel like they're the better plays. But when you really start to understand the variance, that's one of the things that'll be cool about the range of outcome projections, is just seeing, how much more likely is Le'Veon Bell really to outscore David Johnson and that type of thing. So that's what you want to take into account when you're making your lineups. And with the optimizer this year, we make it a little bit easier because we do have a constraint on the optimizer where you can take our ownership projections and set a cap on how much ownership you want in a lineup that's being made. So you can say, I don't want the total projected ownership of this lineup to be more than 100%. So that's a really cool way to build a lineup where sometimes you have that difficulty of finding the balance between the best play and the low owned play, and you kind of arbitrarily try and figure that out yourself. Well, the optimizer can now help you do that. So if it thinks a 30% ownership play is still worth it in a lineup with a max cap of 100%, it's naturally going to force you to be lower owned on the other guys in your lineup, and it helps you strike that balance.
So when I know each slate's going to be completely different, Mike, and this is going to be general week to week, but do you have a particular build that you like to set out for, whether it be cash games or GPPs? Like, are you someone that constantly pays up for running back unless a gigantic value presents itself and then try to roll the dice on some mid-tier receivers? Or do you like to pay up at tight end, down at quarterback, and roll the dice somewhere else? Like, do you have a general strategy, or does that really depend on what you're seeing that week?
I mean, it's like 90+% slate dependent, but the other 10% of the time, I guess all else equal, I do feel a bit more comfortable paying up at the running back position for these guys that have workloads where they're getting, huge market share of their overall carries. They're getting the goal line touches. And what's really important is they're getting the volume in the passing game, especially point per reception on DraftKings. And Drew had mentioned taking guys with multiple outs. Those are your multiple outs. You can stumble into a touchdown. You can rush for 100 yards and get the bonus, or you can just rack up 6 catches for 50 yards and your floor is really high on those guys. Whereas for receivers, you don't have as many outs. Even the top receivers, if you're getting 10 targets, it's not a weird outing to just convert maybe half of those targets for 50 yards. And all of a sudden you've got not that high of a floor for a really big spend. So I would say I prefer paying up for running back over wide receiver, and probably going a bit cheaper at the tight end position because it can be so touchdown dependent that if I'm accepting that variance, I'd rather accept it at a lower price tag.
Drew, are you on the same lines as Mike with this, that all things being equal, paying up for running backs is probably the safest move?
In most cases, especially when you have the league kind of transitioning to so many featured bell cow backs that are involved in the passing game as well. And you have multiple options kind of each week. Now, if the player pool gets whittled down because of injuries, like last year when we lost David Johnson, we lost Ezekiel Elliott to suspension, it might not always be the case. But when you have plenty of options up there, that's usually the route I'd take. And I'd usually save some salary at the quarterback position. I find most weeks you can find a reasonably priced, cheaper quarterback that you don't have to spend all the way up on a Tom Brady or a Cam Newton or a Drew Brees. You can find pretty good price points that you can kind of attack and allow you to set up a little bit more salary relief at other positions.
In general tournament strategy, like let's take something like the DraftKings Millionaire Maker, Drew, that if you find the value quarterback versus like a value running back, so these are going to be the chalky guys. They're going to be the player that everyone owns. Everyone has identified them as the ultimate value. So let's just say week one, everyone's on Case Keenum. And Case Keenum's like $5,100. And let's say that there's a running back injury that happens and that running back is $3,300 and everyone is going to use them. We project them both at like 20 to 30% ownership in the Millionaire Maker. Is there one reason to fade like a quarterback in that sense and pivot onto someone else? And is there an ownership level where a starting $3,300 running back would ever be a fade? You just play that guy and work the rest of your lineup from there.
So the way that I like to think about fades is relative to the scarcity of the position as a whole. So the quarterback position, you're only filling with one roster spot on DraftKings, and you have, most weeks 20 plus quarterbacks to choose from. And the range of outcomes on quarterbacks, because their point production is suppressed by getting fewer points per yard and getting fewer points per touchdown, the range of outcomes is a little bit tighter. So I feel like it's always easier to fade chalky quarterbacks because you can usually find someone similar to them with a similar range of outcomes. A really cheap running back may be the only really cheap running back on that entire slate. So certainly there's a level of ownership that they could get to that you would be concerned about it. But in most cases, I'm less concerned about fading a really chalky, really cheap running back than I would almost any other position because the running back has different outs to being able to control their volume. Now, it does depend a little bit on the skill set of that really cheap running back. If the really cheap running back is like a guy that can't catch passes at all and just won't be used in that role at all, that's an easier fade than somebody who's multi-skilled and is able to contribute in all facets of the game because on DraftKings, that point per reception can really boost the floor for running backs.
Mike, are you somewhat on the same page with this, that if there's a cheap running back and it makes sense on the slate, always take the cheap running back even if he's like 50% owned?
Yeah, I think jamming in that cheap running back, as Drew said, if they're a running back that's going to be involved in the passing game in all facets, it's just very difficult for them to have an outing that's sub 10 points, barring injury. And then you're already at 3x if you're talking about like a low $3,000-ish running back as your floor with the big ceiling. So there's so many things you can do to build around that cheap running back. And Adam Levitan had a really good article on DraftKings about breaking down the teams that won the Millionaire Maker last year. And most of those teams did have one chalkier type player. They had some lower one players around them, but they had one chalkier type player. So you don't have to go super contrarian in every single spot. You just want to differentiate your lineup as a whole. And a cheap running back is a spot where I don't think you have to force yourself to be contrarian if it's legitimately good chalk.
Let's stick with you, Mike. Do you see that there are common mistakes that people make? I mean, Drew just pointed out that when people use optimizers and they have two receivers from the same team, yet they don't have the quarterback from that team because the optimizer spits out a lineup that doesn't make sense and can't grasp that, and you don't notice it. I feel like that would be a mistake right off the hop, not to correlate those lineups. You might be submitting, I don't want to say dead lineups, but like not optimal lineups for what you're trying to build. You put yourself behind the eight ball right away. Do you see other common mistakes that people make?
Yeah, I think in general, just making sure the lineups are logical and make sense, that you want to spend a certain amount of the caps. You're not leaving too much money, too many projected fantasy points on the table. You want to make sure your lineups are correlated. Drew mentioned this, but I know Drew sort of feels to an extent last year, part of the reason why he was successful in mass multi-entry was simply setting up this groups feature that we're going to have on the Daily Roto optimizer and making sure that every single lineup, had a little bit of a theme to it. Like there's some room for some random players. You don't want to get stuck with too crazy of lineups that resemble one another, but you do generally want to say, okay, if I'm going to play this Saints Buccaneers game week one, I've got Breeze. I want to stack at least one receiver if I'm paying up for Breeze. So that's going to be Michael Thomas. And then I'll have one, Tampa Bay guy coming back, give it sort of a game stack deal. And if over 150 lineups you're making, if you're mass multi-entry, but even if you're doing 20 lineups, if every single one of those lineups makes sense, has some correlation, then it's going a long way towards, on one individual lineup, it might not make a huge deal. But if every single week you're doing this and you have slightly more EV than people that are making uncorrelated lineups, or lineups, as you mentioned, that might even go the opposite way where they're, negatively correlated, you're going to gain a lot of edge there.
Drew, do you see mistakes that people make all the time that you can just be like, I would never do that?
It's hard to say. The DFS field keeps getting smarter and smarter every single year, so there's less kind of egregious mistakes as you would have seen before. Which, some of those mistakes, like some people will sometimes play a player that is questionable for a 4 o'clock game and gets ruled out inactive, and they'll leave that player in their lineup because they don't take advantage of late swap. You'll see that sometimes on occasion. Sometimes you'll see things that don't make a ton of sense in terms of the way that they're building, like a quarterback with like 3 of his own receivers. It's probably unlikely that all 3 of those receivers have big days, and so you're probably limiting the total upside, even though it feels like it's correlating a little bit more. Things like that. But in general, the field is getting a lot smarter. I think a lot more of the mistakes that are made actually building lineups are now through optimizers as opposed to people hand building. I think when people hand build their lineups, they often kind of think through a lot of these things. But when you set a bunch of exposures for an optimizer, I think a lot of times people will check the first like 25 or so lineups, but they won't check all 50 or all 150. And by the time they get to the end, they'll have some funky lineups that might have just like too much contrarian and not enough good plays, or might have like overloaded on one offense and not brought back with anybody from the opposing offense, things like that, that will just overall are small edges that you're kind of giving up to the field if you do that.
In terms of mistakes for GPP lineups too, I do think sometimes people mistake like guys that can make a big play but don't have a lot of volume as good GPP plays. I think that big play ability, when nowadays these tournaments are so big, you really want this massive upside for each spot in your lineup, and to get that you need players that are going to receive the requisite volume. So I don't want a tight end or I guess like a cheap receiver, even if he's cheap, that you're banking on one bomb for 80 yards and a touchdown, because even if you get that, are you happy? Yeah, but that's not going to be GPP winning performance. You want guys that are going to rack up, 8+ targets, and they can put together, a 772 line or get to that 100-yard bonus for you. So I think making sure that you have this upside throughout your lineup, and that comes from having reasonable routes to seeing big time volume for all of the players, and focusing on that volume more so than the big playability. So I think big playability, people think GPP, big playability. I think when I think GPP, I think big volume.
Sometimes lineups can get a little bit too thin in terms of 2 stars and Scrubsy, where you're really asking a lot of the bottom end of the roster to be able to hit. And I think that's kind of what Mike's referring to, is that sometimes there's these, deep shot specialists that, if they hit on that one big play and they score on that play, there's an out, but that out is usually for like 12, 13 points, as opposed to like on DraftKings, because the volume matters so much. A receiver has a chance for like 4 for 60 is basically right there. And if they score a touchdown, there's more upside. So I think sometimes people will build lineups that are a little 2 stars and Scrubsy and GPPs and are really asking a lot of multiple cheap players to make the upside work.
Drew, you mentioned late swap. That'd be, if we're playing the full slate on a Sunday, the 1 o'clock games lock, you still have the ability to amend your lineup for the 4 o'clock game. However, how do you use this to your advantage? Because I know people talk about it who are like DraftKings professionals all the time, that they use this to a great advantage. And I'm talking about the player that might play anywhere from like 3 to 20 lineups, because I think that's the person that we're trying to help with this kind of show. I mean, that's where I fall when I create these lineups. I'm not ever playing 150. It's just not, I don't have time to do that. I'll play 20. I may even hand do them or even use an optimizer. But if you're doing that, what is the advantage of utilizing the late swap?
Well, the first advantage is just you have more information at your disposal, not only on a player's health, but on what your opponents have done and how your lineup has done early on. So I think there's a lot of people who will just leave dead lineups out to be dead. And certainly you're not going to resurrect every dead lineup that's off to a really slow start. But for example, if you had somebody in the 4 o'clock games that was really expected to be highly owned, like let's say in week 1, you have David Johnson in a lineup that you're in a tournament, and every other person in the lineup has done really poorly. You're not catching up on the field by David Johnson doing well. You need something to happen to David Johnson that prevents him from doing really well in that game. Maybe an injury or maybe play calling where they just don't get the ball a lot. So you need to take chances to get away from David Johnson and pivot to somebody else that gives you the opportunity to make up the points you've already lost on the field by your underperforming lineup. So there's ways to kind of try to resurrect some lineups from the dead for GPPs, even to try to min cash, that gives yourself more equity over the long haul by consistently doing that. The most common thing that late swap is used for is simply checking on players that have questionable injury statuses and just making sure they're available. And if they're not, you can kind of move over to a player that is available. But I remember one year I was off to this terrible start. I believe I had one of my high-priced running backs get hurt early. I think it was like Le'Veon Bell. And I remember that Marshawn Lynch in the late game was a late scratch that week.
The Thomas Rawls game against Cincinnati.
Game.
I did the same thing.
In that week, I believe also Spencer Ware was the starting running back, or Charkandrick West, one of the two for Kansas City because of a running back injury there. They were projected to be super chalky. My teams were dead. I thought they were completely dead. But I swapped all of my Spencer Ware or Charkandrick West, whichever one it was, to Thomas Rawls. Rawls had an unbelievable game. Ware or West, whichever KC running back it was, got hurt in the first quarter. And I resurrected all these dead lineups that were completely dead. It was a drawing dead $0, like sub 10% of my dollars coming back to me type week. And I ended up profitable. I ended up doubling up that week because Rawls went nuts and the other chalk failed. And it was a low scoring week on the whole. But there are times where you can save your week simply by moving away from chalk if you're off to a bad start. Or similarly, if you're off to a good start, some of those lineups, maybe you do move to a little bit more chalk and try to lock in a little bit of a higher profit.
I mean, you just want to give yourself outs. Like if you're drawing dead, it's a lot of people give up, but you want to do anything you can to, and over the course of the season too, like this example Drew mentioned, that's not going to happen every week. But if that happens 1 week of the season, that's a huge shift in your ROI on the entire season. The other thing too is when we were talking about mistakes people make, and how people aren't making as many egregious mistakes with all the information out there and whatnot nowadays. The one spot that people doesn't seem as widespread is late swap. So that Thomas Rawls week, he was really low owned in that main slate. Not that many people pivoted to him. So a lot of times what you see is people will fix their lineups if one of their guys is out, but they're not necessarily optimizing their lineup to account for, so if they have Lynch, they're going to replace Lynch and not play Lynch. If he gets scratched, they're going to put in Rawls. But they're not taking into account the fact that they can just make a better overall lineup. People aren't paying that type of attention. And it can be difficult on Sundays. I know you're doing things and whatnot. We have the lineup lords, the Daily Roto, which helps a lot. You get an email pinged, Marshawn Lynch is inactive. This is the updated projection for Thomas Rawls. That helps a lot. But it just – there are so many things people are taking advantage of nowadays that makes the edge a little bit tougher. And this is one of the things that people aren't taking advantage of. So I think it becomes even more important when you look at it relative to the grand scheme of how people are playing.
These email alerts that you just brought up, would that be something included in the $129.99 NFL package, 10% off if you use the promo code THEPME?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we're monitoring these scratches Sunday mornings and even after the initial lock, Sunday afternoons, we're shooting them out and we're updating projections, and the lineup alerts, the projection updates are part of the package. As part of the package too, you do get access to our premium Slack channel, and that's going to be, I'm sure bumping this year. It's something that we've started over the course of the last year, and we've had a lot of success with it, especially with golf. The golf people are crazy in there. So you're going to be informed, and you can be somewhat passively informed, which is nice. You don't have to be glued to your computer. You see the email when we send it out for the alerts, you can check it from there. And if anything else happens, we're going to alert it out. We're never just going to be silent if something big happens.
All right. Finally, before we get into the tools and the process of actually starting your research, Drew, I want to talk to you a little bit about correlation and stacking and how to really leverage that to the best of its abilities to help your lineups out. Now, a lot of people are using Vegas over-unders and team point totals for specific games. If there's something above 50 points on an over-under, throwing those two teams. It seems like everyone knows that's a way to look right now. Has that run its course, or is that still the best way to do it? And within those games, are there other types of running back defense correlations or quarterback pass catching, running back tight end correlations that we can look at that maybe people aren't so in tune with yet?
Yeah, I think I did want to mention one thing when you talked about mistakes before. When Mike was talking about that week, the one thing that resonated there with me was use a late player in your flex spot.
Yeah.
One key thing, like make sure that it's not a 1 o'clock player in your flex spot, so you have more options to kind of move around. But with respect to stacking and like implied totals and how people look at game stacks and different things, I do think game stacks are far more popular than they were in recent years. So if you are going to game stack, I think it's more likely going to be beneficial to you long term in terms of being a GPP player and being a successful GPP player to look towards games that aren't the very highest totals on the slate. I think people are getting more adept at doing things like stacking a quarterback with at least one pass catcher and then bringing a pass catcher back. I think those lineups are starting to become more popular. They're still, a small percentage of the overall lineups, but the more you correlate with one specific other lineup, the more you need to beat it at the other spots, and you have fewer spots to kind of make up those points. So I think game stacks often, the ones that are the most successful, are often ones that are from games that are a little bit off the radar, maybe not the highest implied total games, but teams that have good offenses or teams that play fast that might be playing against good defenses and stuff. And then like one big play can kind of change the pace of a game entirely.
Mike, what do you see when you try to correlate lineups and either stack players together, complete game stack? Like I mentioned that one with I like to play a like favored running back along with that defense, hope for a turnover short field touchdown. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't always work out, but sometimes like in week one, like Alex Collins, who's probably not the best DraftKings play, I'm going to play him because I love Alex Collins playing your mighty Bills. But the Baltimore defense and Alex Collins feel like a logical correlation to me.
It is, and that's what I was saying earlier about, kind of having a theme to your lineup, telling yourself a story of how the lineup can go. And the story you're saying there, the Baltimore defense dominates, so they're going to do well. If they're dominating, then the game script's going to be positive, and that's where Alex Collins is going to shine. He's going to shine in a, just continually getting the rock in a positive game script who's shown to be an efficient runner. So those are the types of things that you want to do. And bring it back to Drew's point about, yeah, Vegas is important, and because of that, the highest total games might be a bit chalkier than they should. But when I look to think about how are those touchdowns being dispersed, we want concentrated offenses. The Steelers are the go-to for that. They have Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell that just make up such a huge chunk of their team's offense that there are weeks when they have a low 20s team total, and Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown are two of the top 5 projected players in the entire slate. So you want to think about how things are dispersed. And, counter to that, there's times when New England has a high 20s team total, and we're not really on anyone specifically there because we're projecting that volume to get so spread out. So you want to think about how concentrated are the offenses. And Drew mentioned pace. I know there was a game last year where we did really well on for us and our subscribers because we were on the San Francisco 49ers New York Giants game because we just anticipated there being so many plays running that game, even though the total wasn't that high, just relative to the pricing and the baselines for those teams. It made a lot of sense. So there's things that you need to look at beyond just how many points is the team going to score.
All right, let's get into the tools from Daily Roto. Drew, if you want to pull it up on your screen right now where the logical starting point would be, I do want to remind everyone again that if you go and use the link and use the promo code THEPME, you can get 10% off a purchase of the $129.99 full NFL and playoff season tools, projections, everything from Daily Roto. We'll walk you through some of those right now. Or the Elite Total, which gives you every sports. $5.99, but to get 10% off, that's a significant chunk once we start getting up in price. That's a great deal though, $129 for the year. So Drew, if you're beginning your research for the week, it's Monday, you figured out the injuries, where are we starting here?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I always look at is I take our projections and I sort by the value column, which is over on the far right. The points is just the raw projected points, and that's often how it'll come sorted. But I like to look at value to kind of see, across what positions are popping and what positions are popping in depth. So our week 1 projections, which you can see were updated here on August 18th. That's our last update. They'll continue to get updated during the season a little bit more frequently than during the preseason. But I look and I see, like right away, I see a bunch of quarterbacks and a bunch of running backs kind of leaning up the value pool. So I know there's a lot of value at quarterback and running back right away, right off the bat. And sometimes it'll be high-priced players that project as really good values, like David Johnson and Alvin Kamara. Sometimes it'll be cheap players like Ryan Fitzpatrick. But it gives me a little bit of the sense of the player pool and where a lot of the optimal lineups are going to be generated early on. And it's going to be within some of these cheaper quarterbacks. It's going to be some of the expensive running backs, and then it's going to be more of the mid-priced wide receivers, just based on looking at the value column to start.
So, Mike, when we're looking at this screen, what really goes a lot into this with your first steps of the process? So when you get your general opinion of the week and start researching, where is it at?
Yeah, I'm with Drew. I mean, you're sorting on value to get a sense of, I like to get a sense of who the core plays are, especially when I'm building my cash game lineups. And if there's a couple guys that really pop, I know these are the guys that I'm going to build around. I want to see the different ways that I can build. So if it's a week where there's been an injury to a running back and we got a cheap running back that pops above everyone else, I know, okay, I'm going to be building around a cheap running back. Maybe I can entertain the idea of a more expensive quarterback, or it might be a jam them in week, playing David Johnson, playing Le'Veon Bell, and I know I need to go cheap tight end, I need to go cheap quarterback. So really starting with that value column, I hate to be repetitive to what Drew said, but that's really where I'm starting, especially for my cash game roster construction.
All right, Mike, now that you've assessed the value for the week and that position, what are your next steps to really, like you said, creating a story with your lineup, understanding how the builds are going to work that week? What's your next step? Are you trying to project out, looking at market share, or potentially what has changed during the week?
So yeah, it might be a little bit different for, me as a player versus me as someone who's doing the projections, because Drew and I are working on the market share projections throughout the week and really pinning those down to get them in a good spot. But you can see here that we have customizable fields that you can use or not use. If you're a more casual player, you might want to just use our default projections and kind of mentally tweak from there. But if you do have feelings that differ from ours, or you just want to test different bounds, you can make use of these different options. So for example, you've got Christian McCaffrey, who a lot of people think are going to have an expanded role for Carolina this year. And you can mess around, like, what if he gets more carries? What if we get, the market share of targets, into 22%, not just 20%. And the projection is going to automatically update. So I think that's a really cool thing, that once you've whittled down to like maybe 5 to 10 guys at each position, you can start testing where you think we might be off. Maybe we're right on a guy, or maybe another guy you think this projection's okay, but I see more upside than downside. Let's test out what that looks like. Or it might be the opposite. Dalvin Cook, week 1, back from injury for Minnesota. Maybe you think they use Latavius Murray a bit more, and you want to see, does he still look good if I take that market share of carries down to 61%, of touchdowns to a similar range. And I think that's a really cool way of utilizing what we've built and kind of input your own thoughts into the projections, but not get so far away that you're doing something where the math just doesn't make any sense. We're data guys. We like the math. We want to we're definitely have room for being creative and telling, and as I said, telling yourself a story, but you want to make sure that it makes some mathematical sense. And then after I fool around with some of the volume stuff, I'll just run some lineups. I won't do any stacks or anything. I'll just run some lineups just to get a sense of what's the optimal lineup pushing us towards. Sometimes there's, I mentioned it might be a value running back week. It might be an expensive running back week. Sometimes you can't tell just by sorting on value the build that makes the most sense. So you want to right away, you hit run lineups, and you're going to get the lineups back, which you see here. And we've worked on this display quite a bit, and I really like it. You can see Drew just very quickly ran, I think it was 100 lineups for us. And you see the percentage next to the player. That's going to tell you what percentage of these 100 lineups are they in. So Philip Rivers is in all of them. I know that's a guy that our optimizer really thinks we should build around, whereas some of the other guys that might not be in as high of a percentage of the lineup, like Jordan Reed in that flex spot at 22%. I know that's a spot that I have a bit more flexibility in what I want to do. So it gives me a really good sense of what the optimal lineup is. And then from there, we can talk about how I might massage that for GPPs and start setting things up to make sure my lineups are correlated and make sense for tournaments and set my individual player exposures.
All right, so Drew, when you're using this, do you differ much from what Mike does? And I know that you guys are the ones working on the projections, so you probably don't want to amend them and customize them to yourself all that often. But if you were just someone coming in, let's say you're me, I'm using the Daily Roto product, which I've purchased with the promo code THEPME, and you go in, like, let's say I want to fool around with all of them. Like, is that even sensible, or should I pick specific players I think, you know what, Mark Ingram sucks, so I'm going to set him to 0? and then maybe I'll adjust like 3 other players and go on board with that. But like, how much tweaking should you do, or is it as much as you're comfortable with?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different things you can tweak. As we talked about, there's the customizability of the projections. You can also test out, team game environments. Like if I think Cincinnati and Indianapolis is going to shoot out way above their implied total, and I want to build game stacks with Cincinnati and Indianapolis, I might shoot up the implied totals of both of these teams into the 30s and see how that impacts projections, and I'll bump the plays up for each team as well. And you'll start to see players from Cincinnati and Indianapolis kind of move up the projections. So you can edit on the individual side, but you can also edit on the team side. And there's these little arrows to go back if you want to go back to our baseline defaults as well. But from there, the things that I start to do once I have all the projections set up the way that I want is I start to build out my player pool. And so I'll go by position and I'll kind of just, sort by value, and I'll highlight guys that I feel like I'm interested in playing that week. And usually for me in GPPs, it's going to be players that I feel comfortable that I could stack them with someone else on their team and I could build really good lineups. So that's why we were getting a lot of Phillip Rivers, even though Ryan Fitzpatrick is a better value, is because Phillip Rivers has guys like Keenan Allen and Tyrell Williams and Melvin Gordon that rate well also. So like maybe I don't want Blake Bortles, maybe I don't want Sam Bradford. I'll just start kind of manicuring my player pool and getting to the quarterbacks that I actually want. From there, I'll start to manage exposures, and that's where we get into the settings tab, where you can see right away you have the ability to create global exposures. You also have the ability to create stacks. So if you want to say, I want a quarterback to definitely have at least one wide receiver with every build, you just click one there. If you wanted one wide receiver tight end or one wide receiver running back or any of the above, you can click one there. You can build out game stacks here as well. And I will start to build through this area in the settings. So I have some settings that I've saved here. I'll load those. But I'll have maximum ownership of any one quarterback in my player pool at 20, maximum of defense at 20, maximum at running back. And this will spread my lineups out a little bit more. You can see in these settings that I've chosen not to have running backs included in the flex spot. So that's something I'll do as well. So I'll make all my tournament lineups have wide receivers or tight ends in that flex spot. And you can create how many ever lineups you want there. And that's basically how I start to build out my teams. From there, I do some more extensive stuff with groups and keys that we can get into. But in general, I try to manicure my player pool, manicure my overall position exposures, and then I run a few times to kind of see what's coming back. And then I will if I get like 35% of Tyrell Williams and I say, oh, I only want 20 of him, I'll go individually drop his exposure down, to 15 or 20, whatever I want on that week. And that'll help manage the exposure of individual players that the projections might like, but I might not have the same necessary opinion of.
All right, well, sticking on this, Drew, and when we're thinking about it and you have like 150 lineup build or 100 lineup build, if it's me and I'm playing like 10 lineups or I'm playing 20 lineups, what should the player pool be for that at each position? Because this is something that I struggle with. I think it's something that every non-pro, and maybe even pros do as well, struggle with. Do you want a super concentrated core? Do you want to really concentrate around 2 guys, then spread your wings a little bit at that position? How would you go about trying to build 15 to 20 lineups?
So I think there's a couple different ways you can go about it. One thing you can do is you can just choose to like lock a player right away. And that automatically, all your lineups are kind of coming with like Keenan Allen in those lineups, or you could lock a stack, something like that. But I think the fewer lineups that you have, the more concentrated you should be naturally, because you just have fewer iterations to try to get towards the top of the field. Now, if you're playing on a tournament that, everybody has the same number of iterations, you don't necessarily have to be as concentrated. Like if you're playing a 20 max and everybody in that is restricted to a maximum of 20, you can still run a little bit more spread out allocations, but generally the smaller number of entries that I have, the tighter the core would be for me. So I will usually up my settings exposure for those to like, I'll go up to like 40% of an individual quarterback, 30% of a defense, like 60% of a running back, 50% of a wide receiver. And I can save those settings up here in the upper right. And that'll give me more concentrated lineups when I'm running just 20 lineups as opposed to running like 100 or 150.
So, Mike, when it comes to you and you go through this, whether you're playing, single entry would be different, 3 max would be different. But let's say we're playing in one of these 20 max or even a 150 max lineup on DraftKings. Do you have the same approach? Like, would you start going like 60% exposure to a certain player, potentially even higher? And do you think that when we talk about like mistakes that people make. Do you think that just having too many players in your player pool is one of them?
I think, as Drew said, like if you're limited to 20 lineups because you can't cover as many bases as you want, it might make sense to have a tighter core and then just sort of rotate the combinations of that core. And you can do that in our settings too. Another option that you have there is number of unique players per lineup. And you can see it's at 2 right now. You can change that. So that will make sure that even though you have this really tight core, you have a difference of at least like 3 or 4 players per lineup. Usually I put it like 3 or 4. And that lets me have this tight core where if the core goes off, I'm going to do well. But at least it's not every lineup's like a 1v1. I want it to at least be like a 3v3 type of thing. So I am getting like a decent spread within a core. I know those two concepts sound dissimilar, but I think they go together well. In 20 max, 150 max, I'm generally not playing that tight of a core where you're looking at like 50% ownership on a guy, 60%. The exceptions might be one we talked about earlier in the show. If you get a really cheap running back in the right spot, that's a situation where I could use the lock button, or I might just go like 50 to 75%. I know one of David Johnson's first weeks, obviously not the last couple of years because he's been expensive, but he came in and he was, I think, $3,300 or something like that. And that was a situation where I don't care what the ownership is. I don't mind just going all in on this player for a week. The other exception where I might go really heavy on a player is a lot of times, the guys that we like the most are somewhat in line with the market, but every now and then we just have a guy that we think's a great value straight up. Not even just a good play because he's going to be low owned. We just think he's a good value. We think he's one of the best values of the week. And it just so happens that our ownership projections have him low owned. That's when I start seeing like, okay, this is an edge. This is a guy that I've used just straight up as a good play, and he's going to be low owned. That's when I start to increase my exposure on a single player.
Okay, so you had mentioned that a new feature this year to the Daily Roto package is going to be a range of outcomes. Mike, can you explain that a little bit to me? Because I think I see where you're getting at, but how can you accurately project out the actual range of outcomes?
Yeah, so I'm working on a model that basically looks at our projections the past couple of years and the different baselines of that we've projected for those players and then compares to the actual result. So it might vary a little bit from our base projections because of the way it works, whereas our base projections just like a very like linear math type problem where we're getting to them. This is going to be a model that basically says, okay, you've got Alvin Kamara projected for this yards per carry, this market share of targets. It cycles through every kind of similar player that we've projected over the last 2 years with this kind of similar baseline, similar point totals, different combinations of baselines that are similar, and it can spit out a projection for me for different percentile outcomes. So I can say a 50th percentile outcome, which would be a median outcome I can project for a player. So I think what we'll offer is like a 10 percentile outcome, 25th percentile, 50th, 75th, and 90th. So you get a good sense of like floor and ceiling for each player. And if you have more questions, I don't want to ramble too much. If you have a question about that, follow up on it.
Drew, when we go to you and we talk about, like earlier, you had mentioned adjusting some of the totals on the screen that will up the value of certain players, and you can adjust that whether you think that's going to be a high-pace game. Mike had made the example about the Niners and Giants game last season. The Niners were a very up-paced team. Is there a way to find out these numbers and then have that correlate into the actual projections that you can put in for an over-under?
Yeah, we have the ability to customize and I'm working on sharing the screen here again, but we have the ability to customize the individual play levels as well here. So, San Francisco is playing Minnesota in week 1, and we've got them projected Minnesota for 63 offensive plays and San Francisco for 62. And if you expected this game to play faster for some reason, you can simply up the plays. And as you're doing that, it will up and coincide up the projections of all the players involved. You can also tinker with the run pass distribution or the touchdown rush pass distribution to get better projections suited for the specific type of game script that you're trying to build. And I find that extremely useful for building out game stacks, because this will naturally, when you start elevating the plays for the individual players, you'll start to see more of them kind of funnel up through the projections. It's definitely a way that you can help kind of tinker. You can help guess at like seeing like, okay, these two teams, they're so good defensively that even if I raise the plays a bunch, from a value perspective, I'm not seeing a ton of their players kind of pop through here, at least at the wide receiver position. So, Marquise Goodwin's here, Pierre Garcon's a little bit on the lower side, but I'm not seeing these Minnesota guys, even when I raise their plays. That means that they might not have the same type of ceiling in a game environment without an insane efficiency, like a broken play type situation. So it helps me test out game environments when I'm thinking of game stacks.
So, Mike, when we're thinking about stacking and using Vegas totals and team totals, is there an actual inefficiency when people are not looking at pace of play? Like, is that something that we can exploit going into the season?
I think so. And it goes back to something I said earlier, but you want to look at, volume trumps efficiency. You'll see that if you fool around with our customizer at all. If you start moving around plays, if you start moving around market shares, that's going to have a bigger impact in general on player projections than if you start moving around yards per carry, yards per target, even the team totals a little bit. So I do think people sometimes zone in too much on this efficiency. And on the volume side, the systemic things that don't get looked at are pace of play and, as I had mentioned earlier, how concentrated the offenses are. And those two things together is really where you're going to get the high ceiling games. When you're getting an offense, again, like Pittsburgh, just because they're the easiest example, that is going to be concentrated on, 3 skill players pretty much. Then you start upping their plays, you start upping, the market shares a little bit. You start to see a more impactful shift in the projections than you do on other players. And I think that's where you want to look to your game stacks, concentrated offenses in games where the play totals can get really high. And, instead of looking at, oh, this team has a team total of 28, I'm going to stack them instead of a team that has a team total of 23. That 5 points, I know it sounds like a lot, but it might not make a huge difference depending on how distributed those touchdowns are. You're talking, okay, 28 points, you got to figure out, the percentage of offensive touchdowns and the percentage of rushing touchdowns, and then how those are divvied up. And you'd be surprised that it might not shift even a top running back or a partial running back as much as you would think at the outset. So pace of play and concentration are really two important aspects of game stacking.
Drew, what are some of the other features that Daily Roto is offering beyond the one page of the optimizer and adjustable projections and even adjustable ownership all within that one page? Like, what about ownership projections and other things of that nature?
Yeah, you'll see we have this public percentage area, and that will be populated with ownership projections during the course of the season. And our optimizer, as Mike said, you can set a constraint on the max ownership of a team that you would want. So right now it's set at 900, which is not an issue. That's essentially if every player on your team was 100% owned, that would be a 900% lineup. But if you wanted to, say, hey, I don't want more than 130 combined ownership on a lineup, you can kind of take this down as well. And then the thing that I think we've added a lot to this year on the optimizer side is this groups feature, which really allows you to set rules for your lineups. So like I have a group here that is set up as max one top running back, and that means that I'm going to make sure that I have at most one of Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson, or Alvin Kamara in a lineup, because if I have 2 of them, I feel like that might put too much strain on the rest of the lineup in terms of trying to need cheap players to kind of go off. And you can use the groups to also create like key player situations. I've got a situation where we've got Drew Brees stacks here as a group created, and this is saying any lineup that has Drew Brees will have between 1 and 2 of Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, Cam Meredith, or Ted Ginn. And so the optimizer, anytime it chooses Drew Brees, will then fulfill the rest of the positions with between 1 to 2 of these guys. So I like to use these keys, and I build out a ton of groups during the course of the week to try to set my lineups to make sure that I don't have lineups that don't make sense. Like I don't have a Drew Brees solo lineup that really needs like Drew Brees to throw 5 touchdowns to random people to work out in GPPs. I think that added layer of customizability for groups and keys really helps create a whole set of lineups that are competitive from top to bottom.
Mike, is there any feature that you really want to highlight that you're super pumped about? Because I love this idea of grouping players together to make sure that you're not missing out on any sort of correlation. I think that's super smart and incredibly efficient at the same time.
Yeah, just to expand on the groups, Drew had the example there with the Saints. And I think most people will use it for stacking, but I also really like the max top one running back group. And just think about different ways you can use this. You could also make that use exactly one of these three running backs. So if it's a week where all three of these guys, there's a huge gap in projection between these three and everybody else, and you don't want, as Drew said, to put that constraint by using two of them, but you think you need that ceiling, that base high projection from one of them, you might use exactly one of the running backs. Or if you've got a situation where there's five, really high chalk players that you like and you want to use, but you don't want to build lineups with, too much chalk, you could put all five guys in a group, regardless of what position they are, and say, use at most two of these guys. So that way you're still able to make lineups with these chalky players that you think are good values, but you prevent yourself from using too many lineups that have 3, 4, 5 of these chalky players, and you start running the risk of lineups that aren't leveraged enough according to the field. So there are some out of the box type ways you can use this grouping feature outside of just stacking, which is really helpful, that I think, just again, lends itself towards every lineup you're making fits within a theme. It's correlated, they work together. And as a result, you do that every week of the season with every week of the lineup you make, you're going to put yourself in a really good position.
Are there any more features that you do want to highlight too? Like even generating the lineups to actually getting them into the DraftKings system?
Yeah, so once you do run the optimizer and you run some lineups, we do have the ability to download a CSV, which you can use with the DraftKings edit entries feature or the upload lineups feature to get your lineups onto DraftKings very easily. So you're not hand entering. So you make the lineups on here. Once they're generated, you download that CSV. And I believe DraftKings has, good help features if you're unsure how to do this, but it's a really easy way to get your lineups into a CSV so that you can get them on the DraftKings site with very, very ease. Like the whole process, honestly, once the lineups are generated, shouldn't take you more than a couple of minutes.
So once you see those DraftKings IDs up there, all you do is go to DraftKings.com, go to the lineups page. There's actually a button that says upload lineups, and you would just take that CVS, Drew, and you would just upload it right to there?
Yeah, you can just upload on there, or you can download your lineups from DraftKings if you have your entries already registered, and you can just overwrite the file and then upload that way. That's the way that I usually do it, but either way will work perfectly.
So, Mike, any final things that you want to talk about as it pertains that maybe we didn't cover, either about the tools you're offering at dailyroto.com or just general strategy for the upcoming NFL season?
Yeah, I'll just mention that we have some volume tools on site that give, the market share of carries, market share of targets, the things that our projections are using. It gives you what's actually happened for the players on teams over the last, X amount of weeks. You can look at the last few weeks, you can look at the whole season. So that might help you if you want to mess around with the customization. But I do want to say too, I know we went in depth with a lot of the features, and for a more casual user, that might be overwhelming. There is a basic view here where you can just look at the DVP, you can look at the line, the spread of the player, and our projection. You don't need to get into all of the individual features if you don't want to. They're there for you if you want to use them. I like to take advantage of them because I think it makes my play better. But if you're someone that's just making 1 to 3 lineups, I think as we went through, sorting on value, generating lineups, sort of getting that idea of how roster construction fits for a week is still going to help your play a lot. And you don't need to feel overwhelmed using our tool.
Once again, you can use the promo code THE PME and get 10% off any of the subscriptions to dailyroto.com for the upcoming NFL season or their Elite package, which covers every single sport. Guys, you got to come back again for week 1, and we'll break this all down for you, right?
Looking forward to it. I can't wait.
We'll be here.
Yeah, see, now I had to do it to you live on the show so I could get you to commit to that. So we'll probably do it like on a Tuesday of week 1, really get everything out there, because I think I'm going to be doing live chats throughout the season, Sunday mornings, maybe once during the week as well. But to have a solid base of DraftKings football information right off the hop to get people prepared. And I think that using these tools, honestly, it might make me a better player this year instead of me just guessing.
You have to promise that I'm going to get the, Pat Mayo show run good and, win the Million Maker or something, though.
Well, I mean, that's only happened once in football. I mean, in golf, it's more of a thing where people who are guests on the show end up winning like $70K or more. But Al was on the show the week that he won the Millionaire Maker.
All right. Well, hopefully I pick up, and then you can stop hassling me because Drew finished first, and I had a lowly second place finish.
Drew, any final thoughts about DFS strategy?
No, I think we covered most of the stuff that I would talk about. We'll continue to have updates throughout the season for our subscribers with some other strategy videos and stuff on how to use and build all these lineups. But we're really excited for the start of football season, and really thankful, Pat, for you to have us on to talk a little bit about our product and about the upcoming season.
Now, how much of your strategy is in that like super futuristic Star Trek chair?
Most of it is. It's the first basic need of any DFS player is a great chair, because if you're a DFS player, you don't get out of the chair very often.
Mike, I feel like your chair game is lacking, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I've got like pieces of my chair falling on the floor, so it might be time to upgrade.
All right, that will do it on the Pat Mayo Experience, the intro to DraftKings football strategy tools and how everything can come together and get you prepared for not only week 1 of the DraftKings football season, but all the way through the playoffs, which again, you can get using the promo code THEPME, THEPME at dailyroto.com to get yourself 10% off their packages. We've seen all the tools. You can go use those and try to optimize your chances of actually winning. I hope this all helped out. If you have more questions, you can follow Drew and Mike on Twitter at Drew Dinkmeyer, at 2hats, 1 Mike, which is a reference which is wildly out of date at this point. Or you can follow me at ThePME on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and check out all of my work up on DKPlaybook.com. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn, Audio Boom, iHeartRadio, Radio Public, anywhere where you can download podcasts. You can find the Pat Mayo Experience free of charge. Put me in your pocket, bring it with you, and catch up on demand, plus the entire Pat Mayo Experience Fantasy Football Intro Kit for the season is up on my Facebook page right now. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Pat Mayo. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience! Experience!